Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Today on Clearer Than Truth, we're joined by Peter Pomerantsev, Kiev-born, London-raised author, journalist, and TV producer, whose work has reshaped how we think about the modern propaganda and information wars. He's the author of Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, This is Not Propaganda, and How to Win an Information War. He's also a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where he works on how democracies can answer authoritarian disinformation without becoming what they oppose. Peter, welcome to Clearer Than Truth.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Of course. So your latest book, How to Win an Information War, tells the story of Stefan Delmer, the British propagandist who ran black radio against the Nazis. For listeners who haven't read it yet, what's the book really about? Delmer, propaganda history, or the information wars we're living through now?
Oh, that's a great question. I hope all of those, all of the above. Definitely, that's what I was looking for when I wrote the book. It's a history book, like an adventure book, really, about a forgotten piece of World War II history. But through that, I'm trying to tell the story of how one subverts, very nasty propaganda. I mean, in Delmer's case, he was subverting Nazi propaganda, but obviously we have particularly, somehow sort of, different but still related forms of very nasty authoritarian propaganda today. So trying to draw some lessons, because there are things that repeat across history. Kind of make the point that democracies have actually been quite good at fighting these very nasty strains of propaganda in the past. We've sort of lost our ability to do so because, we had several decades of peace. So I kind of wanted to sort of give a kick up the arse to democratic forces, because Delmer already faced a lot of the same frustrations that we see today. Liberal Democrats preaching to the converted, stuck in their own echo chamber, really not doing anything to undermine the relationship between authoritarian leaders and their publics, which was what Delmer was focused on. And then, but on a deeper level than that, it's very much about what is the need for propaganda that we all have? Where is the line between your personality and the one that propaganda sort of gives you? When are we truly free? So asking those sort of questions, more universal ones at a lower level.
Let's roll back a bit. You've done a lot about propaganda. Why is that the focus of your work?
It's a really good question, because I just worked in media for a while. And then as I tried to make sense of what I was working in, I'd worked in Russia. I kind of stumbled into, the fact that propaganda was changing. And I wrote my first book about Putin's propaganda. I wrote that before it was fashionable. My first book came out in
2014, I think.
I remember now, probably 14. And over a decade ago. And then I kind of just went on a journey, like trying to work out what's going on across the world, looking at history, writing a short book now about how to fight propaganda. So I just happened to be in the epicenter of it. So that was kind of my personal sequence of events. But I think the reason I'm drawn to it, which I have been thinking about, like having written 4 books about it, having sort of like, I teach many courses about it at Johns Hopkins University. I work with various sort of civic organizations and media to think what we can do about it, and to sort of become like the focus of my life, my professional life. And I suppose really what I'm interested in deep down is this question of when are you yourself, just on a quite existential level. Propaganda is just a way of provoking questions about your personality, your individuality, your role in society. When are you and when are you being dictated to by others? And I'm not of a conspiratorial bent. I don't believe all this sort of rhetoric about hidden manipulators. I don't think that's how anything works. If anything, that's a very effective job by propagandists to convince people they're that powerful. But on a much deeper level, we do all swim in this sea of personas and language and culture that is constantly being tweaked and adapted and manipulated by propagandists, and we're in a constant kind of dramatic interplay with it. But so that's kind of what fascinates me personally. But the imperative right now is to work out what the bad guys are doing and win. So, there might be kind of a personal fascination with some of the existential themes of propaganda, but there's also a very live political one. I mean, I've seen a very similar strain of authoritarian propaganda kind of sweep across the world. I first saw it rise in Russia. Then I saw it kind of, when I moved back to London, saw it sort of sweep over Britain and partly manifest itself in Brexit. Now I live in the US. And, I've written about this problem across the world. I don't think I've actually been in a society as afflicted as the US in terms of the effects of propaganda. In Russia, there's a lot of cynicism involved. People were playing along that they believed the Kremlin because it was dangerous not to. In America, well, you have at least 30% of society that by all polling lives in a completely alternative reality. And of course, the most dangerous part is that they're in power. So we're in some serious gaslighting territory now, as I'm sure everybody knows. But
So, Peter, let me interject and say this. You're alluding to Trump and his followers, but look, I'm a Democrat, and Democrats spend all day listening to Midas Touch in propaganda as well. I'm in the minority among Democrats who think this, but it's not a left-right thing. It seems to me to be an educated thing. Dumb people don't fall for propaganda and think independently. Am I wrong?
Dumb people don't or do?
They do fall for propaganda.
Well, no, I mean, sadly, it doesn't work like that at all. I mean, so you're talking about conspiracy theories, for example. It's not really got to do with education, but in the polling that I've done, which wasn't in America, it was elsewhere, it's not particularly connected to education in the first place, and definitely not to intelligence. But if anything, the people most prone to conspiratorial thinking are people with 2 PhDs. And that repeats over and over. Just think of the 9/11 bombers. They're all like incredibly well-educated people. Actually, it's the other way around. Like when I've looked at cults and stuff, which is also a form of propaganda, it's actually people who are a little bit foreigners, for example, who have problems with the language, who you could say are a bit slow that way. That because clever propaganda is using the way you think. So the more you think, the more engaged you are, the more likely you are to be pulled in. So no, I don't think there's much of a correlation between sort of intelligence, IQ, and propaganda. It's got to do with psychology and personal background and needs. And we see this over and over in study after study. People who are incredibly well educated will repeat lies if they confirm their kind of like tribal values or whatever. And then the brain is always playing tricks on us. Doesn't matter how intelligent you are. The brain is always looking for shortcuts and confirmation biases and all sorts of things that make life very easy for the propagandist. So no, I don't think it's got much to do with that. I think it's got to do with social crises of identity. That's clearly a very big deal. Sense of a loss of status, all kinds of vulnerabilities. But I don't think it's got much to do with or directly to do with sort of like intelligence or IQ.
I'm fascinated by this, because I remember there was a really controversial piece that came out, I think in Harper's a while ago. I think it was called Disinformation Inc. And one of the main issues that the authors sort of brought forward was just coming up with a definition that was rigorous for what disinformation, misinformation, these various terms that are used to describe the actual content of what I think you're calling propaganda. And so I'm wondering if coming out of your kind of saturation in this topic for so long, do you think that there's a really straightforward answer to how you define those things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't think disinformation is a very useful term. It's a very narrow part of influence. It's sort of like purposeful lies. That's with the intent to deceive. I mean, that's a tiny bit of the issue that we're looking at. I think often it's sort of used because people don't want to look at the larger problem, which is sort of a structural breakdown of the public sphere as we know it. So they're trying to focus on this tiny issue. And even then, they usually misdefine it because they usually talk about disinforming content, which is not very interesting, to be honest. if we're going to talk about disinformation, much more interesting is disinforming behavior, so the use of sort of false amplification and targeting through deceptive means or deceptive actors, so you don't know who's behind something. So I think, look, nothing much new has changed in terms of content. The content's pretty much the same as it always was. There's always a lot of lies around and purposeful lies. So I think it's a very misplaced focus on disinformation, then wrongly categorized. We should be looking at disinforming technology. So is something online being spread in an organic way, or is it being spread in some sort of artificial amplification, which is disguised from you? So I don't think it's a very, very useful category, to be honest. I like all the terms are a bit loose and crappy. I've been using the term kind of authoritarian propaganda, but let me just say what I mean. I don't think disinformation itself is very good or bad, as people have always lied. It's not that interesting. What I see as malign, and it has three elements to it. One is that it dehumanizes others to the point of being able to murder them. So obviously the classic one is Nazis calling Jews Untermenschen, but we see it all the time in the American discourse. Yeah. Confusingly, this is known technically as extremism, but that has nothing to do with fringes. Yeah. Which is very confusing for people. And again, not a very useful definition, because when people hear extremism, they think they mean the edge. Sadly, extremism is often right in the middle of society, as it kind of is today. So technically, extremism means when you sort of start denigrating others and stripping away their humanity, and we know the consequences of that. The second really malign piece is using types of discourse or technological tricks, really, that make any kind of collaborative discourse impossible. So conspiracy theories. Ever tried arguing with a conspiracy theorist? You can't. Yeah, because they are so locked into a certain mindset. Or technically sort of swamping our world with so much confusion, lies, and doubt that nobody, can really have an argument anymore. So the destruction of collaborative discourse, which is actually the essence of democracy. We always took it for granted. We never thought about it. We have very primitive ideas about what it is, but without that ability to debate, argue, come to conclusions, democracy kind of stops being democracy as we know it. And then thirdly, it's the kind of stripping away your agency. So you need a strong man leader to do everything for you. In the Trump version, this idea that I am your retribution. Like whenever you have these strong men who are going to say, you surrender everything to me. You don't need your rights. You don't need your this is the sort of at the sort of end point. You don't need your rights. You don't need your willpower to a certain extent. Just give everything to me, and I will solve everything for you. So those are the three malign elements, and they've always been the same. I mean, Nazi propaganda was built around those three. But so that's not new. But we're seeing it sort of reiterate itself in a new technological sort of dimension, which has broken down our ways of resisting this, because we always thought a bit of pluralism would solve this, or a bit of insistence on truth would stop this, or there'll be sort of checks and balances in our public sphere, and they've kind of disappeared for various reasons. And at the same time, kind of a lot of the metaphors and assumptions that we had around how the democratic public sphere would function are broken down. So ideas like the marketplace of ideas, the notion that as long as we had lots of sources, the best ideas would win out through some theory of rational choice. Seems laughable now. So we have this double crisis. We have the return of really a very old form of authoritarian propaganda, but then that's coming together with this sort of digital, revolution that we're all very focused on, and that creates a very heady mix. I think that's the essence of the problem that we face, and reducing that to something as tiny as disinformation. It's kind of a form of denialism. Like, oh, if only they'd stop lying. When even look at the Russian campaign in 2016 to subvert the American election. They didn't lie. They were just saying Trump good, Hillary bad. There's no disinformation there. So it's just it's a way of kind of avoiding how bad things are by focusing on this tiny issue.
I'm fascinated by that first variable, in part because I think the United States went through a kind of what you might call a fever of wokeism, and forgive me if you find that phrase, sort of unhappy, but I just note that I was in academia at the time, and I was astonished to hear, what 6 months before were considered mainstream opinions being described as violence against, certain groups. Just the articulation of the opinion was violence. And I want to underscore that, because when I hear the phrase dehumanize, I'm just deeply concerned that it itself has become sort of morally anchorless, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, we're in this world where everybody, you're quite right. We're in a very kind of postmodern world, aren't we? Where we're like, everything that is said is thrown back at the other until it becomes meaningless. The term fascist has become meaningless. And, yeah, you're quite right. But that doesn't mean we should lose sight of the underlying dynamic. So that's then it's up to us to find new ways of describing why it's so alarming and worrying. But if you're talking about America in particular, I mean, the fact that, I think you put it very beautifully there, the fact that even the most important concepts that we had have become anchorless, and often through a kind of parody and irony, that they've lost their taboo. By the time, and it's like these comedy gropers have done this very well, haven't they? They've sort of like, I'm pretty sure that, right today we have the scandal of DHS using, not actually direct quotes from Hitler, but kind of like, I think they're from Franco actually, but kind of these sort of like traditional far-right nationalist European tropes in their Twitter feed, yeah? Like one nation, one heritage, this kind of stuff. And everyone's obviously leapt on it going, oh my God, the Department from Homeland Security is quoting sort of fascist adjacent rhetoric. And the people who've done this know perfectly well what they've done, just as when, Stephen Miller was peppering, I think it was quotes from Mussolini in his speeches. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was provoking us to overreact or to react. And when you do, you kind of make everything meaningless. And they're just sitting there giggling, looking, ha, 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 you reacted. And at the same time, as you make everything into a joke, you also make it possible. So you make it all to a joke. You make the whole system of taboos and outrage ridiculous. And then you've created this wasteland where you can actually go and do it. So the Russians have always been very good at that. Call everyone fascist, call everyone a Nazi, making that term meaningless, and then they can act like Nazis. So it's like,
right, and I'll just say, and I don't mean to draw these kind of obnoxious comparisons, but there's a serious problem, I think, in the United States in our discussion about immigration, and it's not that there isn't a diversity of opinion; it's that some opinion was considered so unacceptable that they was deprived of a vernacular, right? So I don't actually know if you were a professional and you wanted to say, I think, our country is a very absorptive place. We're better for having migrants. However, there are too many now. I don't know how you could say that without immediately being referred to as a racist.
Yeah.
And given that that's the circumstance, that there was no, acceptable line of argument, how do you have a productive political conversation? And so, that's why I'm concerned that some of my friends on the left may have, adopted that Russian strategy that you mentioned, right? Which is any deviation from our political, perspective of a permissive, capacious, immigration strategy, that we just call that racism, and then it, as you say, things become confused and people, don't want to associate with things. So I mention this because I've seen it myself as what I hope to be a thoughtful conservative in the United States. And it's very worrisome to me. So,
yeah, I mean, look, I've only been in America a few years, and it's very hard for me to get a sense of the full sort of toing and froing of the various culture wars. But certainly centrist Democrats, especially Democratic politicians, talked a lot about curbing immigration, from Obama to Hillary and also to Biden. They were just completely impotent to do anything. I mean, the problem there was not the rhetoric, but their total inability to create policies that show they're doing something about it. So I don't know about the left as a kind of like culture, but definitely centrist Dems that wanted to win elections knew that you had to talk about this. But then they were just bizarrely impotent and say what you want about the many malign sides of Donald Trump, but on the border issue, he seems to bully the Mexicans into sort of like improving things on the border. But obviously, what we're seeing right now is this. For me, as a European, looking at the sort of what ICE is up to brings back all sorts of very, very unpleasant historical associations. But yeah, I mean, you're going to have to explain America to me. I see phenomena that are consistent with what I see across the world, and then because they're part of a much larger trend. And then there's things which are very, very specific to America's culture war discourse, which are I haven't. They don't seem to always be very, very conducive to finding solutions.
Right. I mean, I'll just say that I was in the UK when Brexit happened, and I remember in my department at Oxford really becoming the skunk at the garden party when people were just saying, this is the end of British democracy as we know it, and I just interjected the opinion, which I think really resonates with President Trump's election later that year and subsequently, which is that every elite, it seemed, in the UK, besides Boris Johnson and a coterie around him, was deeply against Brexit, and yet like the population itself voting on the referendum by a small margin favored it, right? And so I think we run into problems with this definition of democracy when despite having a public debate that seemed to favor one side, that side doesn't succeed, right? I mean, I don't think President Trump was favored in the public discourse around the election in 2016, or or later on, 2024. So I just mentioned this because this is my concern, right? I have concerns about historical propaganda, but on the other hand, that suggests a kind of dominant media narrative in favor of the state or in favor of the state's project, and I just don't see it. So, but as I say, these are eccentric views, especially in academia. So
on Britain, I mean, like as you know, virtually all the British newspapers were pro-Brexit, all the major ones. So, if anything, like if we're talking about elite as in media ownership, that was very heavily skewed towards Brexit. So, Telegraph, Times kind of was neutral. Obviously, the Mail, obviously the Sun, Telegraph. So all the newspapers were pro-Brexit. So huge media dominance for the pro-Brexit camp. The TV in Britain is kind of neutral and had to give both sides equal amounts. Britain was always against the EU. I mean, British identity was always posits itself as not in Europe. So actually, whenever you did any polling in Britain, most people wanted to leave. It was a case of just having, them having enough sort of like encouragement that it would be okay. And it hasn't been okay. It's led to a decade worth of sort of stagnation and Britain's very sad demise on the world stage and its economic power. And, so it was always about that. Brexit was always about, would the nation go with its anti-European instincts? And Dominic Cummings talks about that a lot. It's just about making them feel confident enough to do it. And they did. And it turned out that the instincts that it would not be very good for the country turned out to be right. Most people regret it. But I'm not saying we should go back. But whether it's about democracy or not, so we're talking about the Brexit referendum. The problem there is, I think, very much sort of the questions remain about sort of the technological aspects. We had this wave of new technology being introduced that wasn't being regulated. People didn't really understand how it worked. One side took full advantage of it. The other one was very, very, very... Well, the other one just didn't campaign. I mean, the Remain camp didn't really get going because they were arrogant and elitist and thought they had it all sewn up. But So the lingering sense of not quite democratic really comes from the sense that there were, to have a lot about it in my second book. I mean, Vote Leave essentially ran a very contemporary digital campaign with micro-targeting to different audiences, spreading completely different messages, and so kind of the country merged, not really understanding why it had voted for Brexit. So the most popular campaign that Vote Leave did, in terms of ratio to getting people to vote, had to do with saying the EU is responsible for stuff around, for kind of like being cruel to animals. So they managed to target the animal rights groups. Kind of I'm not saying immigration wasn't a bigger issue, but immigration was already baked in. So, but in terms of actually moving people, that was a very big one. And there was a somewhat of a sense that those sort of highly targeted campaigns that had not really been in the public eye, that they had no one really followed them or checked them or really been understood how exactly they had been planned and worked. So the democratic deficit there, if we're talking about around Brexit, was really about the technology and just a confusion about this new technology. But in terms of democracy, I mean, a lot of people think that direct democracy and referendums is the they're a question about referendums. Is direct democracy and referendums democratic, or actually do we think about democracy in a much more slow and checks and balancing kind of way? But it's probably the debate you need to have there.
Yeah. Peter, well, one real quick, if George has to go, would of course love to keep you. I just know he is dealing with some work emergencies today. But when I became familiar with your name, it was because of your great book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And I think that's how a lot of people know you. Unpack that title for us. What were you trying to get to, and what specifically does that title mean?
Yeah, I was trying to encapsulate in one line a propaganda that I saw in Russia in the first decade of the 20th century that was all about not kind of convincing people of how great the Soviet Union was, which was the 20th century Kremlin model, but essentially creating so much doubt and a sense of truth being unknowable that people became dispirited, disillusioned, cynical, and they could, and the Kremlin could take advantage of that. So not so much trying to convince as just trashing the very idea of truth in the first place, which is something that we've seen a lot of. I mean, it was always there in propaganda. Doubt is our product. It was, of course, a line used by the sort of tobacco companies in the 50s and 60s, I think. So it's not, the idea that you would see doubt and confusion as a tool of propaganda, it always existed, but it became kind of the dominant in political propaganda. I thought that was quite new. I was unconsciously misquoting Hannah Arendt. She writes about something similar in Nazi Germany, which shows how history repeats. Now, I have no idea whether I'd read that at university, it stuck in my head, or I'd heard it somewhere, but I wasn't doing it on purpose, but it was kind of cool that I was in the end, because it showed this sort of weird echo between the two regimes. So that's what I was trying to get to, and it reminds the best title that I've come up with.
Certainly the most catchy. Let's talk a bit more about Russian propaganda. When do they use propaganda, and when does it work?
Look, all propaganda works when it resonates with its audience. All propagandists are always thinking about their audience and what will they do in order to understand their vulnerabilities and then use them for their own benefit. I mean, that's kind of the job. So when people say things like, "Oh, that propaganda only worked because people were ready to accept it," that's because the propagandists did their job. That's not a demotion of the propaganda. That's literally what it is. If we take a definition of propaganda as communication that gets the person creating it what they want from the person receiving it. Yeah, so it's not a collaborative discussion and somehow one person getting something out of the other one. Then the way to do that is to understand their vulnerabilities, their preferences, and then using it for your own advantage. So for the Kremlin, they wanted to keep the population passive, and they kind of went with their cynicism. People were already super cynical. They already didn't believe in very much. And so they kind of took that to the nth degree. Instead of trying to convince them of things, they'd say, well, there is nothing to believe in. There is no good democracy out there. Everybody is corrupt. Everything is awful. Therefore, you need a strong hand like Putin to look after you in this nihilistic world. And therefore, when we lie, it's fine. And when we steal, it's fine. So they were taking something that people already felt, a sort of deep cynicism, and then using that for their aims.
I believe this was in your book, but it could have been another. But I want to unpack how it actually works. So who decides that the Russian government needs to talk about denazification of Ukraine? And then how is it implemented? And then how do they actually measure results?
So look, it's still a very centralized system. So at the end of the day, all decisions about propaganda are taken by, well, it's now it used to be one person, now it's a couple of people inside the presidential administration. That's what the country's run from. Now there's one kind of, so now Sergei Kirienko is kind of taking control of everything. But for a while, you had a bit of a split between people looking at foreign stuff, led by a guy called Gromov, people looking at digital, people looking at legacy media, and Putin was kind of playing them off each other, which he likes to do. But something like that, and then they're polling all the time. And sometimes the polling is leaked and we can see them trying different messages, seeing what works. The denazification one failed, by the way. It was too complicated for people. They couldn't understand what the fuck that meant. And so they actually moved away from that quite fast. It was one of the ones to use at the start of the
How
war.
Could they not understand what it meant?
Because it's such a mouthful. And now people, ordinary people, what the hell is this?
Nazis bad, anti.
Yeah, but it's it's still very abstract, and it's like a complicated word, not a word that anybody would.
Well, what are they talking?
Huh?
What are they talking? What are they talking about right now when they talk about their propaganda within the current war in Ukraine?
So the main thing they found was basically it was much better. Ukraine is too small, or seems too small to be the main enemy. So it's all a fight against the evil West that wants to repress Russia. So it's always framed as a civilizational battle against an evil West who wants to destroy Russia. It's seen as a defensive battle. We were forced into this. And Ukraine is just a pawn. So the idea that Ukrainians have no agency. So it almost doesn't matter if they're Nazis or not. They're too small for the storyline. So the storyline is evil West. For a long time it was evil America. Now that America is on side, it's evil Europe. Europe is the arch enemy and has to be destroyed.
Is that message taking?
It works because it falls on an overall kind of cynical and conspiratorial worldview. It makes Russians feel big because they've got a big force attacking them. It works very well with something that some sociologists call collective narcissism, which is a kind of a story that says that, you're great, you haven't been recognized, you haven't got the respect you deserve for your greatness. There are others who are inferior, who therefore deserve to be destroyed, like the Ukrainians. But the main thing is to extract respect. And Putin's always talking about respect from your adversaries, who need to recognize your innate and historically beaten up glory. And that falls on a personal psychology of people feeling very insecure, on very fragile. It capitalizes on the fragility that people have. They get to associate greatness with a group. I'm part of this big group, and they get to kind of explain away all their personal failures through some abstract enemy. It's not my fault that my wife left me, it's NATO.
The next time I get dumped, I'm going to blame NATO. So you write about something which I am personally a little bit obsessed with, which is noise. Noise is a tactic. In This Is Not Propaganda, you describe a shift from classic propaganda to a strategy of creating noise, flooding the space with contradictions to paralyze people. How does How to Win an Information War build on or revise this argument now that you've spent more time looking at historical cases?
That's a great question. I do think noise is something very specific to us. That's very much, my last book was about that. This Is Not Propaganda was about that. And how do we deal in a world of noise? And it really is, it's in everybody's language. How do you find the signal through the noise? How do you work out what they're trying to do in order to not get distracted? So actually the book I'm working on now deals with that a lot. So on an emotional level, how do you resist the emotional battering we get online. And what do we do when there are so many sources that simply checking sources or researching a website won't actually help you? It'll just take you down rabbit holes. That's the big change. Before you used to go, oh, look, here's a media saying this. I'll go and check it somewhere else. If you start doing that now, we've all done it. You'll lose your afternoon, going from clip to clip, source to source. I mean, you go down a rabbit hole, and you'll lose so much time. And I think the big switch is from the days of Delma or someone, or the days of limited media, is that now you have to be much more focused on understanding how your mind works, how your emotion works. You can't control this chaos around you. You can learn how to understand your own mind and your own emotions and how they're being used. So it's weird. It's not about media literacy anymore. It's about turning inside and kind of emotional literacy and metacognition, which is understanding how your own mind works. And in a weird sense, we've worked out that more information won't save you from manipulation. Yeah, I think that's a huge change. I was definitely brought up with the idea of go and check lots of sources, and more media equals more knowledge, and all that, these kind of cliches, which I just think are out the window now. And so that's the big change. I think for the Delma book, what was so interesting was the deep psychology of why people are attracted to authoritarianism, which really has not changed. Really has not changed. People are attracted to the cult of a strong leader that can they can sublimate their desire for violence, father figures, narcissism through. People are drawn to a collective that feels superior. People are drawn to the daily cabaret of being given social roles to play and a language through which they can, through which they can feel and see things and even love. That's what I found fascinating. So the deep psychological needs have not changed, but the information environment and issues like noise, I do think is radically different, really radically different.
Do you think that the people creating noise know that that is what they are doing? For example, does Nick Fuentes understand that he's creating noise in the US, or these sort of weird lefty commentators? Or do they think that, where is their head? What do they think they're doing?
You'd have to ask them. But it is interesting how, you can kind of almost have like all your emotional, social needs and conflicts satisfied without ever leaving your phone. I mean, you can be outraged and follow and become extremist and and obviously it has real world impacts, and we see them through the horrendous political violence in America and other things. But actually, you could just live out the whole drama online without ever doing anything. Podcasts feel a lot like that. Their community.
Hopefully not ours, but others. Yes.
Well, we're having a podcast about propaganda, so it should be better. But there is something to that. Everything can be lived out, in that space now. So, do they think they're contributing to noise? I don't know, but they definitely know they're part of the cabaret.
Peter, how does someone spot propaganda, and how do you fight back against it? This is something you wrote a bit about in your recent book, but how do you spot it and how do you fight it or ignore the noise?
So I think we always have to look at its kind of like effects on society. I think sometimes people confuse, like, if we take propaganda the way I've defined it today, with these very kind of like negative effects on democratic discourse, then I think that you have to look at the effects, always focus on the effects. Propaganda is not actually good faith arguing. People having strong beliefs is fantastic. That's what democracy is. People have vociferous beliefs and they represent them and they stand up for them. That's great. I don't think all rhetoric is propaganda. I don't think all persuasion is propaganda. I think it becomes something else when it's not actually, doesn't matter what they're saying. They're trying to get to something. The Russians don't care if they're left-wing or right-wing. They're just finding a way to kind of divide America. They kind of engage with the people, Russian campaigns spreading far left or far right propaganda in America. They don't care. You have to watch out. Oh, they are trying to do this, or they're trying to like muck up an election, or you always have to, like, when you've worked out what the actor is up to, the worst thing you can do is engage with them as if the arguments matter. The arguments don't matter; it's the effect that matters. I mean, just go back to the 2016 election. The Russians don't care if Hillary Clinton is corrupt. You can try to argue with her. Oh, she's not corrupt, like whatever. They don't care. They just want you talking about it. So the worst thing you can do is try to almost answer back and stand up for truth. What you have to do is go, this is a Russian plan in order to fuck up the election. Let's make sure we don't help them, which famously American media completely failed to do. So I think when you've left the sort of hurly-burly of democratic discourse and you've got into something else when the intent is not the same as the content. So I think that's very, very important, and that takes a certain coolness. You have to sort of be able to see what the purpose of the propaganda is, and then act against its effects rather than react to every little trigger that they're trying to pull. So. Yeah, it's very interesting reread. For my new book, I've reread this wonderful psychiatrist, Lifton, and he wrote a very famous book about how people survived Maoist thought control.
What was the author that you
Lifton. He just died, actually, Lifton. But it's very interesting how he talks about how people resisted Maoist thought control. And one of the main ones was not letting themselves get sucked into the arguments, because they were being told that you're an evil bourgeois capitalist, you should repent. And some people start going, maybe I am. God, what if I am an evil bourgeois capitalist? God, what have I done wrong in my life? And the ones who survived it would never start thinking about it. They were like, okay, these guys want to do this because, let's say I'm a Westerner or I'm a teacher. They want me to then do a confession to make them look good, break alliances. This is just political warfare. Yeah, no one actually cares about my political beliefs. They just want to use me for something. And the moment they could see that, they would never allow themselves to get sucked into the discussion. They do lots of things then to delay it. So if they were foreign, they would go, I don't understand what you say. I need a translator. Others would use humor. Anything that distances you from getting enraptured inside a debate that's actually there whose very existence is designed to suck you in and use you in a certain way. So you need that level of coolness. The danger, of course, is cynicism, that you just become super cynical and say, they're just manipulating you all the time. And that's another form of silliness.
Peter, you've generously given us more than 40 minutes of your time for something I'm supposed to take.
And both of your questions are very, very good.
Well, thank you. But I have to ask, give us the name of the new book, if you have it, and when is it coming out?
Oh, we don't know the names yet, but it'll be one of these kind of like 25 ways to defeat malign authoritarian propaganda, but we don't know the name yet. It'll just finish, just like 80% done writing it, so I think maybe this time next year, February, something like that.
Okay.
They take a year to write out.
Tremendous. Yeah, and where can listeners follow your current work?
Oh, I've been so focused on the war in Ukraine that I've sort of kind of got a little bit distracted, but this year I'll restart my journalism. Where have I been writing recently? I've been the FT sometimes, the Politico sometimes, the Guardian sometimes, but really the last 2-3 years I've been very focused on books and then doing a lot of work around the war in Ukraine, where really I've been helping other people get published. I created a war crimes NGO called The Reckoning. We're constantly putting out media articles about war crimes in Russia, including a very big piece I did in The Economist about how you find propagandists legally culpable. So really the last few years have been much more kind of like helping other material reach audiences. I just felt that journalism really wasn't enough during such a big crisis.
Yeah. Well, Peter, thank you again for joining Clearer Than Truth. Looking forward to having you on again soon. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to subscribe and give a rating and share with your friends. See you next time.